When I talk about the Bible, it's very personal, so I don't want to get into verses. I don't want to get into...
There's no verse that means a lot to you that you think about or cite?
The Bible means a lot to me, but I don't want to get into specifics.
Even to cite a verse that you like?
No, I don't want to do that.
You're an Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy?
Probably equal.
Hi again, everyone. It is 5 o'clock here in Washington, D.C. I'm Alicia Menendez in for Nicole Wallace. When Donald Trump was first running for the presidency, that is what we saw in his appeals to the religious right. Now, several years later, after having won over the evangelicals and nominated 3 justices to the Supreme Court who voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, Trump is showing Christians he is still their supposed champion. But his approach has taken a much darker turn. Last night, Trump spoke at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Nashville, where he characterized the upcoming election in the starkest of terms: a battle between good and evil, the need for Christians to safeguard themselves against a wicked system. And then he revived rhetoric that last year had the hair on the back of the necks of authoritarian experts stand up.
This time, the greatest threat is not from the outside of our country. I really believe this. It's from within. It's the people from within our country that are more dangerous than the people outside. We can handle China. We can handle Russia. We can handle all of them if you have a smart leader. But the inside people are very dangerous. They're very sick people, in my opinion, in many cases. They're sick.
And just to be clear, he wasn't talking about himself. Now, we don't like to further amplify Trump's fear-mongering, but it's important context to get the full picture of his authoritarian ways. When Trump first made comments about the enemy from within, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a professor at NYU who studies fascism and is often on this show, said, quote, "There are echoes of fascist rhetoric, and they're very precise. The overall strategy is an obvious one of dehumanizing people so that the public will not have as much of the outcry at the things that you want to do. What Trump wants to do is win back the presidency and rule with absolute power. He believes the president can do whatever he or she wants. He has talked about weaponizing the Justice Department against his enemies. He's currently attempting to fight his criminal indictments by saying a president is immune from prosecution. It is an argument currently before the Supreme Court after a district court ruled against him in the federal election interference case, as well as defense he used in a filing just last night in the second of his federal cases, the classified documents one, saying that the decision to designate records as personal was an official act as president. With the 2024 race fully underway, we are seeing Trump's authoritarian bents become more and more overt and brazen. And that is where we start this hour with former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security, MSNBC legal analyst Mary McCord. Also with me, Professor of Politics and Journalism at Morgan State University and an MSNBC contributor, Jason Johnson, and the founder of Democracy Docket and partner at the Elias Law Group, Mark Elias. A lot of friends with us at the table on Friday. When you hear all of that, Mary, which alarm bells go off for you?
Well, I mean, this is classic, him going out, him trying to pander to a particular crowd. And it's really, I think, offensive to people who actually are Christians to hear some of what he says. You know, Christians Against Christian Nationalism is one organization out there saying, look, you know, Christianity is about accepting all religions, not saying this is the only religion. So he's not being true to the you know, religious people who actually believe in what Christianity stands for. And again, it is that type of fear-mongering. It is that type of just simply pandering to those who we think he wants to hear that. To hop ahead, though, to his, you know, his motion last night on filed a similar motion to dismiss the Mar-a-Lago case, the classified documents case, very similar motion to the one that he filed in D.C., where he lost, where he said, I should be immune from criminal prosecution from everything that I did within the scope of my official acts of president. In D.C., he said everything he did that had to do with undermining the election was within his official acts, talking to his Department of Justice, talking to state legislators, talking to Mike Pence. Now he's saying everything I did with respect to the classified documents was within my official acts because I made the decision back when I was in the White House to designate some of these as presidential records. But notably, that would only help him for the classified documents offenses, right? Not the obstruction offenses, which there's no way he can say he committed those when he was back in office. But I think what he's trying to do here is get a different decision out of Judge Cannon than what he got out of Judge Chutkan. maybe hoping you'll get a different decision out of the 11th Circuit, maybe trying to convince the Supreme Court. Keep waiting a while to decide, give me more time before you make any decisions about the pending motion in the Supreme Court to take this case. Because, look, we need to let this percolate down here in the 11th Circuit. He's really trying to create his own circuit split. I don't think he's going to get it, even if he gets a win from Judge Cannon. But I think he's trying to make this all look more attractive to the Supreme Court.
So let's tally it up, Mark. You have a perversion of religion. You have a perversion of justice. You have a perversion of democracy. And it's not just him. You had a right-wing conspiracy theorist at CPAC yesterday saying, I just want to say, welcome to the end of democracy. We're here to overthrow it completely. We didn't get all the way there on January 6th, but we will endeavor to get rid of it. It's not even saying the quiet part out loud. It's saying the quiet part with a bullhorn.
Absolutely. And this is not just some conspiracy theorist. I mean, CPAC is the Trump convention. Right.
No.
This is like, you know, the RNC and the Republican National Convention is all well and good. But if you want to know what Donald Trump and his supporters believe, CPAC is the blessed, it is the authorized vehicle for that. And so it is time for us to recognize that these are not just words. You know, when Donald Trump records a robocall or records a video for Ronna McDaniel of the RNC, he doesn't mean any of that. When he says these things out of his own mouth to the Christian organization, or at CPAC, his supporters talk about doing away with democracy, that's what they mean.
Yes.
When they say that this is following up on January 6th, that is what they mean. Mm-hmm. And so when you see them try to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat in elections, that is what they mean. And they mean it because they are trying to steal the outcome of the elections. They are trying to set up an excuse and a permission structure to engage not just in frivolous election litigation, like I was involved in fighting against for President Biden, but setting up the next January 6th. Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing, which is I think often we focus on Donald Trump for good reason, because he is persuasive. There are people who listen to him. At the same time, the threat has grown beyond Donald Trump. It is not as though if he doesn't win the nomination and doesn't win a second term, that the threat goes away, because there is now a legion of followers who are not pro-democracy, who are actively talking about overthrowing democracy. And so in that way, that is what actually needs reckoning with.
Alicia, the whole part about the sort of Trump rise that's always been problematic to me is that we don't spend, as you're pointing out, enough time talking about there's like 37% of the American population that's perfectly cool with white nationalism and fascism. Like he can't do what he's doing if there weren't groups of people who wanted to sit and listen to this nonsense at CPAC. Mm-hmm. I can tell you right now that I want to create the dictatorship of Jaysanistan, okay? And I can announce that right now. I promise you, no one is going to come to a conference to join Jaysanistan because no one believes me.
But I think you get like half a dozen people.
I think I get some of my students. Yes. I think, you know, maybe my mom, maybe my
a half dozen of your
half dozen. Oh, yeah. So that's the problem. The danger is that we have a CPAC conference full of people who worship this man. He's at a Christian conference, and I want to be clear, a Christian nationalist conference. Yeah, right. I know a lot of Christians. There's probably Christians on this set. Those people aren't there, right? These people aren't talking about the Bible that I have any understanding of. And so that is what's dangerous, that we have an increasing number of people who are perfectly okay, including a crazy guy who got a canceled television show who was hanging out in another country, who's basically saying if we have good grocery stores, it's okay to have a dictatorship. We have too many people who are saying that fascism is okay as long as the trains run on time. And that's the danger that Trumpism has created in our public discourse.
The fact that he is pushing this immunity argument to me is all part and parcel, right? Because there's this idea of I am greater, I am omnipotent, I can do whatever I want. And yes, that is about authoritarianism. It is also about sort of this idea of having a person who is called upon to be of service.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that a lot of the commentary on this network and more generally in the thoughtful media is about the impact that the immunity rulings will have on the trial date. And that is not to be ignored. But there's another reason why he is pushing so publicly this immunity argument. You know, sometimes, and I do a lot of work for candidates, and I know all of you have been involved in campaigns to one extent or another, you know, sometimes you want the candidate to run on a platform so that when they win, they can govern on it. And I think Donald Trump is also setting up a reality that he can say, if he were to win an election, look, I told you I was running on an immunity platform. I told you from the day I announced I could shoot people on Fifth Avenue and still get elected. And I ran on a platform of defying court orders. I ran on a platform of not returning documents that I'm not entitled to. I ran on a platform of having January 6ers, acquire that I called hostages. And I ran on a platform of being able to be immune and do whatever I want when I invoke the Insurrection Act. And so I think it's very dangerous, not just because he's trying to delay his trial and all of that, but because he wants this to be a legitimized view if, God forbid, he were to be reelected.
I don't appreciate being called myopic, but I will take it from you because your analysis is incredibly spot on, right? Which is we often focus about what is next, how this changes the timeline, in part because we want to see accountability, and accountability is tied to the timeline, given that all of this is proceeding in the midst of a presidential election. However, that said, I do take Mark's point, and we often talk about how the arguments put forward by Team Trump aren't necessarily legal arguments. They are political arguments. I think we often say that as though they are political arguments meant to persuade the electorate. I think part of what Mark is saying is they are political arguments meant to lay a groundwork for future governance.
I mean, I think that's true because, Trump is out there saying in all of his rallies and all of his speeches, you have to have immunity to be president. You can't possibly do what it takes to be the president if you don't have immunity. Truman wouldn't have been able to drop the atomic bomb. And then, of course, he mentions other things that presidents have done in wartime and things like that, right? That these are functions that are expected of our president. And then in parallel, his attorneys are basically making the same argument, right? You have to have immunity if you're president, or you're not going to be able to do any of the things that president needs to be able to do. And moreover, they take the next step and they do exactly what Donald Trump is also promising he'd do, which is if there's no immunity here, then this is going to start a cycle of retribution that repeats with every single presidency. Once out of office, the new president persecutes the former president. And it's almost like that's inevitable. That's what's going to happen. And of course, that's all, again, because Mr. Trump is saying, I'm being persecuted, right? And I will persecute my enemies when I am elected president again. He's been very open,
It's
right?
just so interesting. I know that we are past the point of being surprised by hypocrisy, the irony, but that, the supposed small government party is now talking about and supporting a rapid expansion of executive authority.
Only when it benefits them, though. Right. Like that, that's the whole thing. None of this has to do with the economy. None of this is helping anybody with health care. This is just, I want to make sure I can beat up on everybody that I hate when I get back into office. And I think the scary part to me is when I look at Merrick Garland, when I look at our absolutely corrupted, completely illegitimate Supreme Court that has 3 justices on it who shouldn't be there right now, and if we had a Congress that would do its job and wasn't completely dedicated to keeping this madman in some potential access to political power, they would impeach these people. We have too many people in our federal government who do not recognize what the danger of this is. The man has basically said, I'm going to get back into office and I'm going to throw everybody in a gulag. Everybody who I don't like, everybody who looked at me the wrong way, I'm going to throw them in a gulag. And rather than the Department of Justice being more aggressive about these issues, rather than the Supreme Court saying, hey, I'm going to take this case right now and shut this down, everybody's letting this stall, everybody's letting this continue. There should be no immunity for this. You can't have immunity forever. Alicia, I can't call shotgun in 1997 and always get in the sidecar. It doesn't work that way. And that's essentially what the man is arguing. And instead of people seeing this as an inherent danger, we have a Justice Department and we have a Supreme Court that are basically saying this is fine because we think we're going to survive no matter what happens if this man got back in office.
I think there are also those, Mark, who would argue when it comes to the question specifically of the Supreme Court and immunity, that they recognize that they are making a decision that is broader than Donald Trump. And that would be based on pretty thin case law, that the stakes are high. And while you would make the argument the stakes are high, let's get moving, they would make you the argument the stakes are high, we need to get this right.
I think to a point, sure. But I'd offer a couple of observations. The first is the U.S. Supreme Court moves very, very quickly on matters that it wants to move very, very quickly on. There are a lot of men and fewer women, but men and women who have been executed by the U.S. Supreme Court moving quite quickly to ensure that they get executed. We have seen the Supreme Court, when it wants to halt a expansion of voting rights that a lower court orders, we have seen the Supreme Court be able to move pretty quickly in halting the expansion of voting rights. So you know, there is fast and there is fast enough. The second, though, point I would make, which really echoes Jason's, is that, you know, there's a saying that goes back several decades that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. Okay, we call these folks justices for a reason, right? Their job is to dispense justice and to ensure that the courts are not turned into a vehicle of injustice. And I think, you know, this is not aimed at any particular justice or even any particular court or trial court, but it is very important that the judges and justices who oversee these Trump cases not allow themselves to become used and instruments of non-justice, of injustice, by lawyers who are willing to say and do anything, and by a defendant, a criminal defendant in many of these cases, who's willing to defy norms. I have been appalled, frankly, at the leeway that he has been given to attack the judicial system by courts that seem paralyzed, courts that, by the way, if you go down the street to D.C. Superior Court, are not paralyzed if there is a black man in his 20s who looks askance at a bailiff and on a drug or a petty drug charge and gets thrown in prison, or gets thrown in jail for contempt.
Right. I mean, this question all becomes bigger because we're asking, will these guardrails hold if he were to have a second term, right? So right now it feels like we are testing those guardrails, and that is why there is so much attention, energy being spent on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's, you know, not only has he been clear about what he wants to do as president in terms of being all powerful and omniscient and untouchable, but, you know, he's also telling us beyond weaponizing the Department of Justice, you know, that we're going to be having roundups of undocumented immigrants in the cities and flying them by military jet to, you know, essentially concentration camps.
And there's some U.S. citizens who get caught up in the mix.
That's just the way it is, right? Yeah. I mean, the playbook is there, right? And so we have to call attention to it, but we also have to, you know, steel up our institutions. And I know we can sometimes talk about justice moving too slowly. There's no question about it. But I mean, the courts have actually been, in these last several years, some of our best places to go to ensure that the rule of law matters. I mean, Mark was responsible for so many of the cases, or defeating the cases that Trump and his team brought after the last election, bogus, frivolous cases, baseless cases that were thrown out of court because the courts did the right thing. I mean, we can quarrel with some of Judge Cannon's rulings in the Mar-a-Lago cases, but, you know, the judges are, you know, they're getting to these cases. They certainly moved very fast in D.C. Supreme Court's taken a little bit of time now to make a decision about whether to take the immunity case or not, but they've moved quickly, and they do seem to, and I would also point to the January 6 cases. 1,200, more than 1,200 cases that the judges in the D.C. District Court have had to handle. Many of those having gone to trial, many being sentenced. Those judges are coming out by the person and condemning what happened and condemning that people like Mr. Trump are calling them hostages or political prisoners. And these are judges that are appointed by Republicans and judges that are appointed by Democrats.
I think it is why, though, there is an appetite to see that accountability get closer and closer to the inner circle. Mary McCord, Dr. Jason Johnson, Mark Elias, what a panel. Thank you so much for starting us off.